Good morning, folks. I'd like to welcome you all to this session. My name is the Honorable Jackie Weatherspoon, and I served 3 terms, but 6 years in the New Hampshire House of Representatives. I've also worked for the State Department to Bosnia-Herzegovina. I've also worked not only for OSCE, but for the UN. I have served the UN in Nigeria, Malawi, and Tanzania. In the House of Representatives, after I came back from Beijing, China, my first piece of legislation that I put in was the CR resolution, HR 1325. And as you all know, in the United States, we're still trying to get it over the finish line. So I'd like to welcome you to the session. The name of the session is Sharing Responsibilities for an Effective Struggle Against Trafficking of Women. Now, I was asked to do this session at the last moment, so I pulled together some materials for you, your handouts. I say that to say, as a disclaimer, I've never worked with the organization that's mentioned, but they had some very good materials. And I heard Nicholas Kristoff speak about this program, and so I read about it, and I said it's worth at least sharing the information. Secondly, I am on the board of Harvard University, and there was a program that was enthusiastically done by some of the law students, and they brought back a number of slaves. So you have those materials as well. That's just fodder, or for examples for you to use, or you can extrapolate from the work that you have done. This supposedly is a 90-minute session. I was so happy to participate in the session yesterday. I would ask for the audience, when you make a comment, you need to keep it short, because we want to allow everyone in the room the opportunity to speak. I know some of you are very anxious to talk about your program. As well, I will make sure the speakers have their cards ready, their business cards ready, and yours ready for you to exchange and have each other's information, because I know that's extremely important for a number of people that are here. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers, and then we will get going. First person on my left is the Honorable Kim Campbell.
The Right Honorable Kim Campbell.
It does say that.
No, and there is no left honorable. This is an arcane.
On my left.
I know it probably does.
Yes, this is going to be a good session. On my left
It needs very.
is
It's not garden variety.
on my left is the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, as written.
Yes.
The Right Honorable Kim Campbell served as the 19th and the first female Prime Minister of Canada. And I think, if I'm correct, you are the only woman who has served.
Yeah, isn't that annoying?
That is worth saying again, the first and the only. Thank you.
So far.
I live in hope.
To the left of the Right Honorable,
Yes, that's good. Left honorable.
and all protocols observed, is the Honorable, or the President, former President of Finland. She has served the maximum term of 12 years as President, which is absolutely fantastic. The Honorable Tarja Halonen of Finland.
For years politics.
Well, you can make comments, please. And to the left of the Honorable of Finland is a good friend of mine in the struggle, as we call it, is Miss Ruth Ojiambo. Ruth is the Executive Director of the ISIS-WICCE International Cross-Cultural Exchange in Kampala, and has worked with dozens of organizations supporting women's rights and human rights. And most recently, the years that I've worked with her, she has been working on issues in peace and conflict, peace and security, and she will definitely be one of our experts of women in the ground that participate in trafficking. Welcome, Ruth. I'm going to skip over you, sir, and go to a former member of Parliament and former member of Community Development, Papua New Guinea,
the Honorable, or I should say, Dame Carol Kidu. A teacher by profession, was first elected to Parliament in Papua New Guinea in 1997 and was re-elected in 2002 and 2007. She is presently the only woman in the 109-member Papua New Guinea Parliament.
That's changed. We've just had our elections. I did not stand. I've retired, and now there's 3 women.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, very good.
Huge.
And as we save one of our best champions for last, Mr. Luca, as we have agreed, because I cannot pronounce his last name, is the permanent observer for the International Organization for Migration to the United Nations. Mr. Luca was appointed Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration, the Washington office, effectively this past October 1st, 2012. And let me give you a little bit more of his background because I think it'll be very important part of our session today. Prior to his assignment, he was Special Envoy to the Director General of the International Organization of Migration for Haiti from January 2010 and assumed the function of Resident Chief of Mission in June 2010. Thank you very much. I welcome you all this morning, and I will then begin to read the instructions of how this morning will go. Our speakers this morning, they have been given the great title of Initiators. And as you know, they are all members of Club de Madrid. They will each have 5 minutes to make their opening remarks on the following topics. And have you folks assigned me a timer? Because there was a timer at the session. You're my timer? Thank you very much. And will you hold paper up? Okay, so there is a timer. So that means, folks on the panel, get your important points in. So maybe what I'll do is, before we get started, if there's anything about your background you want to share before we start the topic, I think that is very important because we need to come out of this session with some recommendations. And I want those recommendations to be quite clear. So are there any opening remarks that you would like to make first before we tackle the topic?
Just go for it.
Okay, very good. Okay. You will each have 5 minutes. So let me read the statement out. Despite increased efforts among relevant actors, there is a disturbing upward trend in the trafficking of women. Based on your political life and other professional experiences, which would be your 3 main proposals to move the agenda forward in this area and fill existing gaps? Okay. The right.
The right. I'm just joking. I'm either the Right Honorable or I'm just Kim. My sister calls me Right Honey. We're not very formal in Canada. I just have this thing about getting it right. But in the United States, people always say, well, there's a Right Honorable. Is there a Left Honorable? No. It means the Very Honorable. As in, that's right nice of you. So I sort of feel in the South to say I'm the Right Honorable. I mean, that just works. I also served as Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I was the first woman to do that, and I was the first woman defense minister in the NATO country. I wish I could say I had 3 pithy little recommendations of what to do, but let me just say a few things of my own perspective on this question of trafficking. There is a book by a Canadian writer called Victor Malarek. The book is titled The Natashas, and it is a horrifying book about the trafficking of women, particularly from the countries of the former Soviet Union. And if you want to understand both how this happens and the whole sequence of events that creates this wicked practice, this is a book to read, but it is a very discouraging book. And he also has a blog site called The Natashas. And he calls them The Natashas because many of these women are women from the countries of the former Soviet Union. One of the first things that of course, comes out of this is that many of these women, and there are many patterns of trafficking around the world, and we think we'll hear a bunch of them, different ways in which people get inveigled into this. Children sold by their parents sometimes, even in some parts of the world. But In many parts of the world, particularly in Eastern Europe, much of the source of the trafficking is poverty, is people looking for better jobs, people responding to advertisements that say, you know, come to France and work as a nanny, or come to the United States, whatever, and then young women answer these ads and find themselves in situations horrifying. And you know, I'm a Canadian, and so I was born into an advanced democracy. I'm born into a society where, notwithstanding the struggles that I've had to engage in my life to promote the advancement of women, but I have rights, I have a sense of empowerment, and it is absolutely horrifying to see how ingenious traffickers are at taking young women who are otherwise knowledgeable, intelligent, and think of themselves as being autonomous, and completely disempowering them and putting them in situations where often the only way out is death. So one of the first things that I would focus on as part of a strategy is, as much as possible, to create awareness in the countries where young people are victimized in this particular way, as opposed to being, you know, sold out by their parents, whatever. But to create a sense of awareness of what the risks are in responding to these advertisements and responding to these offers of jobs, and to try and create viable, reliable clearinghouses, or ways in which people can find out whether these postings, these offers of employment, are legitimate or not, who are behind them. And I think there is a way in which, you know, perhaps social media can be useful in trying to raise that level of awareness and understanding, because in so many cases these are simply young people who want to better their lives, and we know the whole story is that if they happen to have children or whatever, that there's a whole network of blackmail relationships that are built. So I think policymakers need to be educated to understand the perniciousness of this trade, and people who are living in vulnerable populations need to understand what the risks are. So 2 levels of education, very important. Secondly, I think framing the issue for what it is, and you know, the CNN has a program, or yes, I guess a program, not a TV program, but a program a thematic program to counter slavery. And I think it's really important for us to give this the name that it has, that it should have, which is slavery. We're not talking, you know, trafficking almost sounds a bit entrepreneurial, you know, well, you know, trafficking, you know, buying and selling, buy low, sell high kind of thing. But it is slavery, and it is exactly slavery, and it needs to carry with it all of the opprobrium that attaches to that word in the world. So we need to frame the issue in ways that are totally unambiguous about the moral basis of it. And finally, I remember a number of years ago when Louise Arbour was the chief war crimes prosecutor at The Hague, and suddenly I had the great honor of appointing her to the Ontario Court of Appeal when I was Justice Minister, and she was gone on to do great, wonderful things. But I said to her how wonderful it was that systemic rape had been declared a war crime. And she said, but you know, we are able to do this because of the changes made in domestic laws in countries. So for example, when I was Justice Minister, I completely redrafted the law of sexual assault in Canada. So when countries, and when we drafted our laws, we looked at a lot of things that had been done in very progressive American jurisdictions, because your criminal law is a state jurisdiction here. So in Canada, our criminal law is a federal jurisdiction, but we can borrow good practices and benefit from the research and ideas that other progressive jurisdictions enter into in dealing with these problems. But her view was that good domestic laws then provide the basis for pushing the global standards. And as the global standards rise, that feeds back into certain domestic legal systems. I remember once being at a conference in Washington, and a woman from Chile, this was before the Initiators, said to me, how do we persuade our men that they don't have the right to rape? You know, my hair sort of went doing. But I said to her, you're not alone. There are international standards and norms that your country has probably signed on to that can support you. It's not just small groups of people pushing. So that synergy between progressive domestic law and international norms is one that we have to keep pushing to make sure that there are the resources and tools that can be used for people, that can be enforced, that can be implemented and used to shame governments into responding and acting to deal with this very, very, very pernicious practice. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, I thought that was just absolutely fantastic. And I think some of the things that you brought up, not only in terms of parents, you've left that, and I'm sure that's going to come out later, the place of the family and poverty and women working. But you talked about countries that the women are attracted to. You also talked about women who were smart, but when it came to certain issues, they became dumb. Also, the power of the press, where these advertisements are. I thought that was just so good in what you said. And you talked about, are there clearinghouses for these ads? What can we do on the proactive side? And the use of social media, and I hope that comes out a little bit more today from the audience, if you folks have that experience. So I'm really anxious, and I'm sure most of us are anxious to hear what is going around in that sector. Again, the policymakers need to be educated. I always said when I was in the House of Representatives, I spent more time listening than I did making laws, because especially at a hearing, you begin to know what really was happening on the ground. And that's the purpose of a hearing before you actually enact law. So there is lots of room for policymakers to be educated. So.
It's me?
Yes.
Okay, so I give a first warning. I'm also the former lawyer. I worked with workers first 10 years after the student revolution, after the 10 years with trade unions. So I know that how difficult it is to make good laws, which could also after implementing in the working places. So the second thing is that I was 20 years as a member of parliament, and I have been also Minister of Justice and Minister of Social Welfare. So all that telling only that this is very difficult to create such kind of legislation or international conventions which could be effective if the people are not the right position in their mind. So we come back to the education. You have to respect the laws, and you have to have your own will also to behave in that. And that's concerning, of course, also that how we see our fellow citizens, that where we think that we can help. So my first demand or my proposal is sharing responsibilities in all levels, which means global, regional, national, personal, and try to find the ways how we can act in all these levels. Because of course we know, and I think that we will hear more about the Luca on that we are missing the global legally binding convention or agreement concerning the migration in such. We have agreements concerning the refugees, we have some regional agreements, but we have not real tools in that way for UN and other global organizations to work. We have to work for this. The second is, of course, that we should note, the third one is that we should notice the gender discrimination in this business. I mean, it's bad, it's terrible as well if they are the boys or girls, the children, what the people are trafficking, or the slavery concerning both the men and women, but there is a certain special point, which is the gender discrimination, which means that the girls and the women are in special difficult situation because of the sex and because of some other issues. So to see this, and even we have not the globally legally binding agreement. So we should see that, for instance, we have the setup. We have an Article 6, which is taking already this by the UN, this gender discrimination, and then I think that it's good also to remind you that ILO has just recently, in 2011, got on the convention concerning decent work for the domestic workers. So it's also the question that we noticed that there is some steps forwards, and to make a good noise, a positive noise about those agreements, and tell, like also Kim said, that we are not alone, that these are now also the agreements what has been accepted. And if the countries concerned are not past them to say that you should do it, you could do it, it's just a political will that you could do that. And then the third one is that I think that we should also to give the encouraging examples to each other that how you can solve the issues. Sometimes also the situation is what is created are very very interesting. For instance, in Finland we have a lot of Somali refugees, and so of course with them also the people who are not the refugees as such. The facts happen to be that the last airplanes which left Somalia were Italian Alitalia and the Russian Aeroflot, and they both, Italy get a big part, and then the others went to the Moscow because that was the only flights you had available. And if you are in Moscow and you see that there is not a very good place to be in that time, so do you take what is the cheapest way to go to the west, and that was the train to Helsinki. So that's why we were not so popular. We just happened to be the right railway station. But so we had our lessons. But then second thing what I want to mention is that when we want to get these new areas, regional politics, like we have the European Union, and we have been so happy to get this kind of area of the freedom with no boundaries inside. So the second point is that then we should have also some means how to handle the issues which can come from one country. For instance, we have the European Roma minority, fantastic people. I have worked with them a long time. But how they were treated, I say it by name, Romania and Bulgaria and some other countries, of course caused the situation that when these countries became the members of the European Union, even we, some experts, we were warning that that should be now looked very carefully. So the people start moving, not by their own will always. Very often it was a trafficking. And then we saw in the north also that people begging on their knees in minus 20 degrees, which is really freezing, because some others wanted to get their money. So how to solve this kind of issues, I come back to that. If the situation of the people in the country where they live is not human, so the best way would be to work those circumstances there, that people could find their future, the country where they are used to be, and if they then travel, that they could travel it in a decent way. So in that way we have to shake hands with the countries we don't know always very well, but even the closer countries can be those that who don't want to speak about these issues. And that's it.
Okay, so Ruth, I think now you should speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm coming with an experience of working with the women in situations of armed conflict. And as we all know, that is a time when people are very vulnerable. The laws are not operational, and there are no opportunities for very many people, and especially women and girls. So for me, I really believe that trafficking is about power and money. It's an economic issue. And as you've just said, people don't just move from one place to another because they want to move, but it's because of the desperations that they are in. And the movement is not done by they themselves. We need to recognize that some are coerced, some don't even know where they are going and what they are going to do, but they are just believing there is a way out of here so that I can survive. Mm-hmm. Others, of course, are in a situation where they are looking for little to eat, and whoever is there to give them that is the one they feel is a savior. In September, in my country, Uganda, 15 women came from Iraq. These were professional women who were formally organized to go to Iraq for better jobs and earning in dollars. They were taken. Immediately they arrived at the airport, all their passports were taken away from them. They entered into Iraq, and little did they know that they were going to become not only sex slaves, and that's why I agree with you, it is really sex slave, but there was humiliation, torture on a day-to-day basis. Because they were educated enough, they knew they would run away. One time they just ran out, screaming and shouting. And that's how American colonels, American Marines, found them screaming and running, and they were brought back to Uganda. Now, I'm giving you this story because I want us to interrogate the issue of law and to what extent does it work. Because they were brought back, little was said. We didn't know anything that these people were moved from Iraq back to Uganda. Everybody went silent because one, the group that took them was formally registered as a group that gets employment for people. It was related to the army, and everybody had kept quiet until the women's movement came to know about it and brought this issue out, took it to Parliament. The women testified and petitioned. As I speak now, it is silent. So even when and my country has the Trafficking Act, which came out in 2009, very beautiful act. But is it only the acts that matters? And that's what brings me to my reasons for what we should do other than just looking at the law. The law is there. It takes forever. People come out of trafficking with a lot of pain, with a lot of destruction of their bodily integrity, and nobody seems to get all this other than migrating in, getting them out. So what I believe should be done to stop all this inhuman suffering, especially of women and girls, particularly from conflict setting, where nobody seems to have an agenda for them. One, I think it is time now for us to design financial policies that are pro-people. In Africa, we find the financial policies now don't care about people. I grew up growing cotton, and my cotton took me to school because they were cooperatives. Today, everything has been dismantled. No cooperatives, everything is international investment, powerful people with money, and that has made even the little that women would do to sustain themselves to be taken away. And what do you do as a woman who wants your family to survive? You look for opportunities, and that's where you get the sharks, the complex, very systematic network, which even governments in Africa cannot dismantle. It's huge. So I think that is one. Two, it is time for communities to police themselves. Let's sensitize communities to police whatever is happening in their communities. My sisters and brothers, it's not only sex that they traffic. We need to do more research, but what we hear from the women we work with, they traffic people for body parts. It is, and Africa is the center. You find so many desperate people. So you can go and pick them and just go and get all the body parts you need. That's one. Two, there is this language of abduction. When we are in the military, it's abduction. Oh, they have abducted children and girls and women. Abduction is not only for fighting. We know there was abduction between LRA in Uganda and North Sudan, where our women were sold as slaves in northern Sudan. Where they went, how, we don't know where they are. So all these are issues that call for policing by communities themselves. These days we don't do civic education anymore. It's only political education. And this has pulled away the knowledge from people who would be policing themselves. And there is nobody who can, you can't trust that the law will protect you. The law is useful, definitely, but the person has to protect herself. How do we know about the traffickers? What do we do? And all that. And finally, I think I need to pose a question. Who monitors the states? Who take obligations to protect their people And when things happen, nobody protects the person. Who is monitoring our states? Let's not talk about just trafficking in and out. We know even within our countries, trafficking is going on from towns to villages, from villages to towns. So I would propose that we need not talk about only the laws and the policies, but our countries also need to be monitored if they are not really abiding with the commitments that they have done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Carol Kidu?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm coming from a Pacific perspective, Papua New Guinea Pacific perspective, and I'll start by saying that trafficking in the global sense is being discussed here has not been an issue in the Pacific up until now, in this global sense. There is anecdotal talk about Asian women coming into Papua New Guinea, whether they're being trafficked in or whether they're coming in as international sex workers on tourist visas is not clear, so that would need to be looked at. So I'm not going to talk about trafficking in that global sense, but I'm going to talk more about the grey area between abuse of custom and when does abuse of custom become almost like trafficking within. And that's an area that has become of concern, perhaps in Papua New Guinea. Now, I want to make it very clear now that this is not a pervasive thing over the whole country, but it is certainly emerging in some tribal groups. For example, traditionally in Papua New Guinea, there were marriage exchanges made, the opposite of the dowry. There were payments made. In my husband's language, it was called dava. I had a small dava paid for me, and I recognise that this dava type thing can be a protection for women. But nowadays, dava, it became translated into the word bride price, and that price concept has now commodified the concept of dava. Dava was actually like glue in society that kept the society together, but now it is commodified. And people are now bringing in, instead of just pigs and food, traditional food, and shell money, people are now bringing in things like cash, trucks, household goods, and all sorts of things into this, what is now called the bride price. It's payment. This is now commodifying women and giving men the opinion, and even men's families, which is unthinkable, because before the family had to protect. For example, I knew that my mother-in-law would protect me if there had been any violence in our relationship. But nowadays, even the family of the man will sometimes now victimize the woman if they feel she's not living up to expectations. And so it can be used as a reason to excuse violence that is unacceptable. So it's a grey area. It's not trafficking, but it's an abuse of custom that is leading to abuse of women. In Papua New Guinea and in the Pacific in general, marriage was an adult relationship. We did not have to deal with the issue of child brides, like some of our Asian neighbours are still dealing with the issue of child brides and how to deal with that. But nowadays, it's known that particularly in urban areas where poverty is a recurring issue all the way through here, poverty means that parents will turn a blind eye to the issue that their girls, their young daughters, quite young, might be going off to clubs and making friends with older men, sometimes from overseas, quite often from overseas, or else the wealthy elite. And they'll have expressions like, oh, Madi Mai Turana Point, she's got a friend. And they pretend that it's just a friend. But in reality, it's more than just a friend. And these things that are emerging with the issue of poverty. So again, we go back to the issue to address these abuses of women and girls. We have to address poverty. We must address poverty. We must look at economic empowerment of families. The issue of awareness is so important, and community policing, I love that expression, community policing themselves. Community is critical in this so that communities can take ownership of it. How we can address disempowering language. For example, my daughter, after her father died, 1 year after his death, she was sitting in the communal family meeting, and she tried to say something because her father was a well-educated man and was very liberal and everything. And the moment she tried to speak, one of her uncles said to her, in language, Pasuherase Maro. Don't speak, you have no right, you are only a girl. She was an adult girl. She left the room and just broke down and cried and said to me, Mum, my dad would never say such a thing to me, but many girls growing up hear that type of language. Don't speak, you're only a girl, you have no right. So we've got to address these underlying issues of disempowering language within the idioms of the culture and the language. So those things, we've got to get right down deep into community and what's happening in community that allows these behaviours to be condoned. Legislative responses. The third area, my first area is the address poverty. Second is awareness in communities, awareness in the nation as a whole, and helping civil society to hold places accountable. For example, we have laws about child prostitution. I passed them in 2002 when I was Minister for Community Development. But no, those laws are not being implemented. Clubs are not being held accountable. And so we've got to get civil society to take up have the courage to hold places accountable. Legislative responses, again, the intimation here has been that they're unnecessary. They set benchmarks, but they will not change reality for quite a considerable period of time. We must have the community responses with it. In 2002, I passed legislations in Papua New Guinea to make marital rape illegal, to make rape gender neutral, about child prostitution. But in reality, it is now 2012, 10 years later, and it's still very hard to bring a marital case rape to court. Police don't want to charge, etc. They want to hide away from it. So legislation is essential. It's part of the awareness process, but it's got to be a lot more at community level as well. Yeah. I think they're the main issues that I want to bring. Addressing disempowering customs, awareness, constant awareness with parents, with society, and then legislative responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Luca, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about this issue on the 18th of December. Today is the International Migrants Day. It's a day that marks the entry into force of the UN Convention on migrant workers and members, on the protection of migrant workers and members of their family. And as it was said, although it's a convention that is in force, it's a convention that is certainly not universal. The number of ratifications are extremely small and basically mostly from labor exporting countries rather than countries of immigration. Therefore, its usefulness is still very limited. But still, it's an important international tool, and the UN is promoting its wider ratification. I think it is important to mention it. This goes in the issue of the legal framework that we have available, and certainly the 10th year since the Palermo Protocol has been approved has seen a very high number of ratification. 147 countries have ratified this. I think is a record number given the somewhat limited time frame. And as a result, countless of national legislations have been enacted. Thousands of law enforcement officials have been trained on the issue of trafficking. Information campaigns, shelter for victims have been implemented. A number of programs, including in this country, which is a very interesting programs to offer temporary protected status to victims of trafficking, plus a number of return or integration opportunities for victims. It is a wide array of tools that have been developed. But the point is, as it was said by Madam Chair, is how effective have these tools been? And the picture is very uneven. I believe that in certain areas, certainly there's been much progress, but trafficking is a ever-shifting phenomenon. I come from a country like Haiti now, where you have the issue of so-called reste avec, which means stay avec, remain with us, which is basically a phenomenon of child indentured labor. But it's not perceived as such by society. Probably is what yesterday President said in terms of harmful traditional practices. Cannot call it Haitian culture, but certainly something that needs to be addressed, and we hope that there will be champions for this cause. But again, we believe that with 215 million migrants, of which 50% are women, and with the projection that perhaps in 2040 there will be 400 million migrants. Something needs to be done to avoid that countless numbers will become victims of trafficking. Of all migrants, it is said, according to the UN survey on global trafficking just issued by the UN Office for Drugs and Crimes, that 75% of the victims of trafficking are women and children and girls. So it is an extremely high incidence of female exploitation. And exploitation is not only for sexual exploitations, it's also for labor exploitation. I think that the focus in the last few years has been mostly on sexual exploitations, and the issue of labor exploitation has gone underreported. I think we need to refocus on that as well. It is equally important. The human consequences are equally devastating. As I was saying, the case of children certainly is one case, but it goes beyond that. And possibly also rethink some of the measures that have been taken to tackle the issue of trafficking, whether they, in fact they produce the expected results or perhaps some unintended consequences. And thinking of more restrictive migration regimes that in certain cases, for security reasons or perhaps for protecting domestic labor, have in fact reduced opportunities for migration and enhanced vulnerability of women migrant workers. The case of profiling, for instance, of typical trafficking victims in certain countries has almost stopped the possibility for legal migration opportunities. And this feeds into clandestine mechanisms, which almost inevitably will then expose the person to trafficking and other things in a form of exploitation. So we need to look into the issue whether or not the criminal law trafficking approach is a sufficient, certainly is a foundation, but is it a sufficient conditions to eradicate the issue of trafficking, or does it need to be complemented with other policies? Because a criminal law approach obviously tends to focus on the P of prosecution, perhaps neglecting somewhat the so-called P's of prevention and protection. Prosecution means obviously that the victim has to prove that the person has evidence to show that has been abused, and sometimes come forward to document and support the stories. These are often very difficult. Issues of prosecution also implies that there is a clear-cut division between smuggling and trafficking. But we often know that somebody perhaps voluntarily gets caught into a smuggling mechanism only to find herself or himself eventually caught into an exploitative situation on which he has no longer the control and the power to emerge out of it. So there are issues that I think needs to be constantly looked into whether they produce the expected results. Certainly low lenses, criminal law lenses on the issue of trafficking is very important, but they need to complement it perhaps also with a broader migration management framework that allows to protect and to protect victims and prevent the issue of trafficking. And I think on this we can identify 2 or 3 key issues. One certain is to have specific vulnerability programs that address specific circumstances on the specificity of certain vulnerabilities to the issue of trafficking, the issue of having better control of migrant workers and their working conditions, making sure that states have inspectors and inspections are carried out, particularly as we know that several migrant workers are outside unionized formal labor, are in caregiving positions, often isolated and therefore more sensitive to these issues. And finally, for policymakers, there is a continuous need to have updated data and information on the issue of trafficking. If we have regulations that tend to underrepresent or underreport the phenomenon, we'll never be able to catch the new trends, identify ways and modalities to assist the victims. So these, I think, are my points. Thank you.
Can I just add a comment? Because just something, I'm getting sort of demented and I might lose if I don't say it right away, that comes out of the excellent comments. there's always a great concern about how to deal with the victims of trafficking, and in many situations it's complex because, particularly if they've been sold into sexual slavery, going back to their own countries is very difficult. How to integrate them, and the risk that they have in, and even participating in a prosecution because they're often highly vulnerable. But one thing that sort of struck me in this conversation, that there is a kind of analogy that applies in terms of some of the changes that we've made in our societies, at least certainly in Canada and other advanced democracies, and that is if we think of the issue of domestic violence. There was a time when the police didn't want to have anything to do with it. This was considered a private matter, so a man could smack his wife, and that was considered not to be dealt with. We now have very different policies. We have zero tolerance policies, and a lot of that has involved the training of police forces. How to recognize when there is a situation of domestic violence and how to respond to it. And those incidents, they are also very complex because very often the person who's committing the violence is the sole support of the family. And if that person goes to jail, the family, so it's a complicated issue. But training police at the local level to recognize, to understand that girls found in brothel situations, for example, may be in fact the victims of trafficking, and they are often themselves treated as offenders and put into the criminal justice system for prostitution when they are themselves victims. And I think one of the things that many of our countries can do is simply intensify the training of our law enforcement authorities at the local level to recognize what they're seeing. Not just in sexual situations, but in situations of domestic employment, where somebody may be there unwillingly, may be a slave, somebody who has been trafficked, who does not have the freedom to move, and may have, the first thing that people do is take away your documentation, so that it makes you even more vulnerable. And I think that is something that we could do on quite a mass scale. I think it's probably being done already, but we could intensify that, and that would be something that would also require a greater level of knowledge and understanding by policymakers who would create those programs and just heighten the level of understanding of what it is that we're dealing with.
Okay. I would like for you, Luca, to just a little bit go over the topic of organized crime at all. Do you have any background on that and the place of organized crime and police as you see this being played out?
Organized crime and police.
Yeah, and policing. What is the role of organized crime as you see it in the work that you do as people are being trafficking?
The complex issue around trafficking is that is a mostly an unreported phenomenon. It emerges at times of crisis very often. We have been all witness of the Arab Spring. In many countries, this has entailed that security conditions or employment conditions have been completely changed, or in a matter of weeks, people that had employment found themselves isolated. Now, we had, as IOM, in cooperation with the countries of immigration in the Middle East region, to repatriate home tens of thousands of migrant workers, which themselves found them without documents, because the documents were taken on arrival, without wages, because wages are not being paid, and basically without any consular protection, also because often the countries of origin have weak consular networks. So this is a typical element which undiscovers a phenomenon such as trafficking in those areas which are less evident, in this case, domestic labor. Now, we have statistics on the amount of money that is used and generated by the trafficking networks. Some $32 billion annually has been mentioned. I mean, these are wild estimates. It's very difficult to but for sure, until recently, the risks of traffickers was very low compared to the risk of trafficking in drugs, for instance. But trafficking human beings had been always often more profitable, also because sentences have been either unenforced or very lenient, or people were able to get away with it. So I think tough prosecution is essential, but as I was saying at the beginning of my statement, a criminal law approach can only help as long as it's complemented by other social programs that are directed to assist directly the victim of trafficking. Otherwise, you will not have the people will not come forward, and you will not even have the cooperation, perhaps, of the demand services, because in the end, whenever there is, particularly in the field of sexual exploitation, there are clients. How can the demand also be addressed? So that the information campaigns that are directed, yes, to the potential victims, are also refashioned and addressed to the potential consumers of trafficking. This is in the field of sexual exploitation. The same could be said for labor exploitations. And there are very interesting experiences and projects of partnership between governments, private sectors, and civil society. We can discuss them later on, but I think it's very important.
I would take also a very interesting and complicated question, but I don't know really how to answer to that. First, of course, concerning the police, I think it's very necessary that also in the countries where you haven't had earlier trafficking, the people which has not been the countries of the transition. So I mean that police sometimes is not naive, but that it's not used to see what's the trafficking. So I think that, for instance, if we take Europe, now the situation is much better than now. Thanks for the international cooperation, more and more countries who have not faced yet this kind of the trafficking phenomenon, that they could recognize when it comes. I can tell from my own country's experience that it took a little bit time before we noticed that it was a transition country. But now we have closed the roads, but I don't think so that the business has gone. They have taken some other roads now. But then the second thing is that what to do. I fully agree what you said, Luca, that it's not only the police business, that you need something else also combined with that. Because normally if you get this kind of a crime into the police, so it's okay. You can do all the legal things concerning those who are responsible. But then what do you do with the victims? If you help them and they cannot return back to home, so you try to organize everything in the country where they have arrived. But do you think so that the others think that that was just that? Then the information that now the things are better can also cause the situation that, it can be bad between, but then finally you get the better chance. And if you don't work with the countries where they come, so in a way you are helping the traffickers, because, I know the Roma situation, they said that you cannot even imagine that in which bad way we have been treated. Whatever you will do, it would be better. So I mean that international cooperation is the basis, and not only with the authorities, but also with the civil society, so that they really understand that this is not a terrible channel, but a possible channel to come from the hell where they have been. So I mean, I'm all the time underlining that we need not police in one country, you need a police in other countries, you need also the other partners in social life to help the situation, otherwise it's endless.
Before we open up to the audience, Ruth, do you have any comments on that topic about working cooperatively with other countries? Any examples where those alliances have been set up already?
Oh, there are plenty of international cooperation modalities at all levels. Certainly at the judiciary level, where good experiences and good practices have been exchanged, so that countries look into the respective legal frameworks, trying to harmonize it and try to make it complementary to each other's needs. So this is very important. Myself, I was in the Haitian in Haiti, and we are working with the Dominican Republic to make sure that between custom officials between the two countries there was regular interactions, so to understand how issues from the part of Haiti, for instance, illegal adoptions were policed by the Dominican authorities, and how, on the other hand, the issue of trafficking for sexual exploitations was coming to Haiti, where there is a large international presence, and in principle there is a large demand, how the Haitian authorities could work together with the Dominican authorities to identify and screen and assist in case victims of trafficking. So these are bilateral or multilateral examples of ongoing practices that needs to be supported, and I believe needs to be complemented by the exchange of information. Probably the exchange of data is still a weak point, but otherwise I think we have very good experiences in terms of transnational cooperation.
So that's a good example between Haiti and Dominican Republic. Thank you. Let's have some comments from Ruth, and then we'll open up to the audience. Thank you.
I think the African Union, and I'm sure my sister is going to say something about it, is really struggling to see to it that there is that relationship within the continent. Because the policies at international level, yes, there seem to be that bilateral, which is working very, very well because they are entering the Western countries. But I think there is quite limited bilateral relationships within the continent of Africa. Probably it's because there is more fear of people being trafficked to the West. And that is where the emphasis is really being put, other than looking at trafficking and where the source is coming from, and when they come back, what happens? For me, my biggest challenge is us focusing mainly on taking them back or having that bilateral. But what happens to this woman or this girl when she's brought back? Yeah. What are the policies in place that will help this woman to regain her dignity and become a person again? We see, as at least our partnership in Nepal, we see women organizations struggling themselves to see to it that they support the women who have come back to make a movement of their own to support those who are coming. And I think this is where internationally we need also to emphasize. When I go and I'm humiliated to that extent, when I come back, the story of these women I'm talking about in Uganda, all their families shunned them. So at the end of the day, where is this woman's life? What do we think about her? She's still a living human being who needs dignity and support. But I'm not seeing international policies really emphasizing on the post-trafficking. And I think that is where we need to do some emphasis too.
Thank you. I saw a number of hands. Yes. Can you identify yourself? Please stand up. Sure. Identify yourself and your group. Thank you very much.
I'm Jenny Klugman. I'm now Director of Gender at the World Bank, but actually directed the Global Human Development Report on Mobility a couple of years ago, where we grappled with, I think, a number of these issues. And I think that the panel has been great in pointing out some of the complexities and the grey areas and so on, and kind of the risk of unintended consequences as well, which I think is very important. But I guess there's just a couple of points I wanted to put on the table, and I guess the first is that I don't think we should see mobility as inherently a bad thing. You know, the way that we approach it in this Global Human Development Report is that mobility is about the expansion of people's opportunities and freedoms, and restrictions on mobility, including women's mobility, antithetical to that. So the kind of the starting point shouldn't be necessarily the fact that people moving is a bad thing, because as a number of you pointed out, you know, the starting conditions are often very difficult. And the other part, and I think a couple of you alluded to this, but I think it's kind of the crux of the problem, is that the restrictions on movement, on regular movement into developed countries and into wealthier countries is what is creating the problems. Because when people can't move legally and safely, then they're driven into these situations. And typically when they, you know, so what we tried to do in the Human Development Report is emphasize the possibilities for creating, if you like, regular movement in a whole variety of ways. Developed countries compete for skilled people at the top end of the scale. So Australia, for example, where I'm from, the US does it. So we're trying to get all the tertiary educated people, but not recognizing that there is also huge demand, you know, of different sorts of people. And so people are moving, but then because they don't have the protections that they need. So it happens to domestic workers, it happens to a whole lot of other types of workers. So I think we should really be putting on the onus on the, if you like, the more attractive countries, whether it be kind of Kenya, South Africa, you know, countries in Europe, Australia, to try and kind of regularize ways of movement to make it kind of safe, legal, and then to have the protections associated with that.
Thank you very much. It's really good. I saw another hand. Yes, sir. Can you please stand up and identify your name?
This is Ashwin Daniel. I'm from the Global Movement of Moderates Foundation in Malaysia. Now, one of the things that I wanted to comment on is that the idea that the fight against trafficking of women shouldn't just end when the victims of human trafficking are rescued, in the sense that there's still huge gaps of understanding and empathy among authorities towards the situation, special circumstances of the victims of human trafficking. And one of the ways that civil society can play a part in this is through a training program for authorities to understand the special circumstances. Like, for example, in Malaysia, there have been efforts by certain international organizations to work with the Human Rights Commission in Malaysia to actively train authorities, perhaps sometimes in shelters and in detention centers, to understand the special circumstances surrounding the victims of human trafficking.
Thank you. Do you have any materials with you, or do you have a website?
Yes.
Can you tell us the website, please?
Sorry, the website for mine is www.gmonf.org.
GMOFF?
gmonf.org.
GMOMF.org. Thank you very much.
So I welcome very much what was said about the mobility of the people. If it's the fact that we all were, our forefathers were in Africa, so we have moved quite a long ways, especially to the north. but it has been through the history, yes, that's true, and that we try to remember. But then when the societies are based on the national states, so this is, I think, a very sensitive and difficult issue, that if you have the countries with sizes like mine, 5 million, my southern neighbor is 2.5 million, Latvia is, I think, that was on Estonia, Latvians are about the same size, and Lithuania is even smaller. And if I think the Nordic countries, we are together about the Netherlands. So should we, I provocated a bit, should we put a lower standard for the welfare, that it will be not so challenging to come to the country? I mean that if you have more or less than open borders, and we have been a very poor country, and we had no mineral or oil or anything resources, just investing in people. So how much we have to risk in order to open all the borders, if we think, for instance, that the Russia alone is 100 million? So but let's not be naive in that way. That we know that we are not the paradise, but the way how, for instance, we treat the Romas is that much better, that they would, every single person, to move to our country if they could be allowed legally. So I think that what we need is the balance between the regulations, not to make them too strict, but to help the people so that they could move in decent way. But America is a different than Canada. You have a different kind of the tradition of the immigration, and you had also some difficulties with your original people. So I mean that in that way, today we cannot allow everything like happen. But what we really need, I think, is an international cooperation, so that people shouldn't need to move if it's not quite, I mean, their own will. Their own will comes, of course, if you are in very bad circumstances. But somehow we should balance this, to see that also in Asia there are very small countries, and then all the groups of tribes and nations, and then you have the bigger ones. And how to balance this? I mean, how to do that? We cannot close the doors. It would be bad. You will never create a good society with the closed doors. But how to make the balance between more flexible immigration, what I also support, and then the guarantee that the society will somehow remain the caring society, looking after it, to give the free education from from the daycare centers to the universities, everything. So is it the only answer to say that we stop it?
Okay, Ruth? Thank you.
I usually want to deal with the underlying cause of all this. And for me personally, I believe if women are empowered economically and they are given the opportunity to do what they go out there to look for, there will be less that kind of immigration.
Yeah.
They will be traveling at happy moments when they are just going to travel. But I think at the moment we are focusing so much on something which we cannot break through. People who are doing it have the money, have the power. It is complex, and little will be done definitely to stop it. But I feel if we can empower these women to utilize the resources that are on, especially I'm talking about Africa. The
Okay,
resources.
so let me interrupt.
Yes.
Give us a picture of what women's empowerment would look like to you.
You know, there's so much resource in Africa. So
Tell
much.
us what that would look like.
One, I think we are endowed with so much in that they could utilize what is available to them to produce for markets even in the West,
Okay.
where they would be sending these products to the West
Farmers, so
for
farmers,
sale,
agriculture.
and they get their money instead of us having middle people who take so much money, and then these women don't get anything. That's one.
Okay.
But can I make a comment? I think it's very important for us not to lose sight of what we're talking about here. Around the world, my country, Canada, benefited enormously by people who gave everything up. And in fact, it's very moving if you come from Canada, the United States, to think of the histories of people, often who were even educated people in their country of origin, who gave everything up to find a new future for their family. And they came to Canada, they came to the United States, they came to countries in Latin America, and often met difficult circumstances. I think of the Ukrainians who came and settled the Canadian prairies, and women went mad living in sod houses in a Canadian winter because of the isolation. But it wasn't slavery. They came willingly, they had an official identification, and they may have encountered discrimination. They may have even encountered exploitation in their own ethnic communities. Well, we think in parts of the United States, I mean, it's this great basis for literature, movies, and these people, the experiences that people have. But it wasn't slavery. And I think what we have to understand, we're talking about here is people who are enslaved, whose identification is taken away, and whose ability to make autonomous decisions, the ability to decide, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to take work. I mean, the big cities of the West are full of taxi drivers with university degrees because they can't use their credentials in the new country. But they have hope for something better, and they are free, they are not slaves. But what we're talking about is something quite different, and it's a very pernicious, very worrisome trend. And many of these people, I think Jenny is right, but a lot of the girls who come from Eastern Europe are coming ostensibly legally. They don't think that they're being smuggled. They don't think they're doing anything illegal. They are answering an ad for domestic workers. They think, I'm going to go and work as an au pair someplace and make some money. And the vast majority of migrants, labor migrants, actually would like to go back to their country of origin, so that laws and regulations that allow people to migrate as seasonal workers and go back. You know, the Philippines would collapse if their people did not go around the world, and many economies and industries, the care industry, certainly in my country, would completely collapse if there were no...
It's a pity that they educate the nurses in order to be household workers in the West.
But I think what we have to really remind ourselves here is we are talking about a very specific phenomenon, which is slavery, which is the trafficking, the sale and purchase of human beings. And what we've already alluded to is what that means to those people, even if they are rescued. You know, in the same way that systemic rape became a war crime, because it's not just, you know, soldiers blowing off steam and, oh, it's the spoils of war, and, oh, you know, this happens, you know, and, you know, to live with it. No, it's a tactic used to destroy a community, because when women are sexually violated, either they are rendered unmarriageable. In many traditional societies, they cannot resume life with their family. If they get pregnant, those children have no status. It is a cruel and vicious way that not only is a physical violation, an attack on somebody, it's an attack on the society. And many of the victims of trafficking are people no longer can be reintegrated. They're not migrant workers who are working for dirt poor wages so they can send money home to their families and hopefully eventually go home and they can build a house in their communities. These are people whose lives are destroyed, and it is a very, very different phenomenon. And I don't want us to confuse it with the bad conditions that some migrant laborers who travel legally meet. There may be a nexus and a kind of gray area where people who move ostensibly legally find themselves without any resources and dragged into that underworld, and that is also a worrisome thing. In the United States, there's a vast amount of sexual slavery of American girls. So you don't even have to have people coming across borders. Trafficking, yes, there is migration issues and cross-border issues, but there's domestic trafficking too. And that, I think, is the issue that we have to look at.
What I'd like to do with, and the hands of two panelists I'm going to let you speak, but we have a limited time, and what I'd like, we really need to come up with some best practices. We've heard a number of things here, and that's why I wanted your email address, sir. We need some models that we want to put on the table, what's going on. So what I'd like for you to do, we'll have the next two speakers speak, and I'd like to come to our initiators. Tell us about some programs that have worked in your country, that have been successful, that we can put on the table at the end of our exercise. So, Mr. Luca,
yes, thank
we
you.
need a best practice. Thank you.
IOM as an intergovernmental organization work with government to deal with these very issues. Certainly, the collapse of economies in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, translated in immediate aftermath with this huge, unregulated, clandestine migration towards Italy and other countries of Western Europe. What has been done in these countries was to set up mechanisms for seasonal migration, for quota system, for mechanisms that would absorb in a regulated manner this surplus manpower, if you like, matching with opportunities, with real concrete job opportunities in the countries of immigration. Take the trafficker out of the equation, but do offer migration opportunities when there is a request, when the labor market requests it, and trying to manage this through mechanisms that are supervised, through recruitment mechanisms that are overseen by local authorities with a degree of competence and professionalism. These are examples that exist and I think have addressed the kind of migration from certain countries which were really
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. Development of quota systems that match with jobs and requests. Okay, is one we can put down and flesh out. Madame.
Okay,
Dave.
you've asked
Carol, yes.
directly. I would say a best practice could be that focusing again on issues that will take women out of sexual slavery. For example, where women are forced into prostitution, say in Papua New Guinea because of poverty, we're working on, and not too much success, I've been really knocked for it, but working on the Informal Economy Act and a policy around the whole informal economy development, which can absorb a huge number of women if we do it properly, so they're not feeling that they have no other way to earn a living than sending their daughters to the clubs or whatever. So it's got to be proactive policies and laws that are poverty reduction ones. And I think this whole issue here, although it's not specifically on the trafficking and the slavery side, I think opening up these less restrictive on the regular mobility. For example, we thought it was a breakthrough in PNG. I felt it was as a minister when we got the 1-year working tourist visa through with Australia. But then I look at it and I see it's got to be for tertiary people only. So only people with tertiary education. So it then again adds to our brain drain. Whereas there's a whole lot of people lower educated who are working as in hotels, I don't mean as sex workers, but hospitality industry, etc., that could benefit enormously from a 1-year working holiday, but they won't qualify. And so we'll just intensify the brain drain of the country rather than help on this whole poverty reduction. Yeah.
Okay. Ruth, you want to speak first? Thank you. Ruth?
Best practice, not in my country, but in networks that we have worked with. There is a Women Resource Center in Kathmandu who are working on post trafficking, the women who have come back to, through counseling.
What's the name of the organization?
It's Women Resource Center in Kathmandu. particularly the women who have been trafficked in the Asian part, but coming back home. They have counseled them, they have put up a shelter, they are working with the legal professionals to see how to enable these women who want to get justice, who know the people who trafficked them, to bring them to book. I think that's a good best practice.
I'm going to have the last word because we have to close. We've been working with women from Zanzibar. Her name is Dori Mashishka. This product was then purchased by Bono. These are high-end pocketbooks that are put together, assembled by women with HIV/AIDS on Zanzibar. And I'd like to pass this around. And some of you, we ordered about 40 gifts. But this is the level of work that women can do, that are being done, and it's absolutely amazing. So I'd like to pass this around. And on that note, the session is over. I want to thank you all, and there's a lot of work to do around this topic. So thank you very much.